I recently started playing The Witcher 3, and I was having a ton of fun with it. The open world feels full, and there's never a shortage of side quests, collectibles, or random encounters for you to stumble upon. I wanted to do it all. And when I tried to do it, something happened. I stopped looking at the game as entertainment and more of some kind of systematic management. I was plotting out the most effective ways to travel so I could experience everything instead of letting it happen naturally. I stopped having as much fun with the game before I shelved it entirely in favor of a different one. I started to think back to all the other games I'd felt this way with, and after wondering if it was just me, I reached out to friends and communities to see if we shared this problem. And we did. Most everyone I talked to had had some game that they'd put down for similar reasons. I've seen the term side quest fatigue used to describe this feeling, but I couldn't really find anything discussing the term itself. People experience this and know how to generally define it, but I never came across anybody discussing it further than, I ended up dropping that game because of side quest fatigue. So what exactly is that? What contributes to it, and is that feeling mainly the fault of the player, or is it a problem created during development? I wanted to look into this and find these answers. It was brought to my attention that people generally appreciate spoiler warnings for games they haven't played. I'm going to be talking about these games mostly from a mechanical perspective, so there shouldn't be too many story-related spoilers, but here's a look at all the games I'll be talking about, just in case. In my research for this video, I came across an idea from Yoko Taro, director of the Nier and Drakengard series. Here he calls the problem open-world fatigue, and defines it as when a player gets bored or tired with open-world games, stating that when tasks become ordinary, they become chores to the player. These tasks, of course, refer to the seemingly endless amounts of side quests, collectibles, etc. But again, I wanted to look deeper. What causes these tasks to become ordinary and make the player lose interest? Well, for starters, take a look at some maps from these open-world games, and notice the sheer amount of different icons and different places that serve as markers for what the player can interact with. You'll notice there's a lot, and it's really hard not to look at these maps and feel a little overwhelmed. To experience all the game has to offer, you would need to hit every single one of these points, and that can be a little too much for some players, who may only want to experience the mainline quests. This is one of the ideas behind why the player might grow bored, overabundance. Every player, no matter how diligent in their completionism, will have a point where the amount of content in a game goes from more than enough to too much. A lot of games will pace this out in one way or another. Maybe like in Horizon Zero Dawn, where the player's access to the world is gradually increased over the course of the game. You start in and only have initial access to the land the Nora tribe inhabits, and therefore only have access to any additional quests or markers within those lands. As the plot progresses, more areas open up and you have more available activities. Most mainline quests will take the player to these areas naturally, so you'll never feel forced to steer too much off the main path to reach side quests or collectibles. And some games, like the rebooted Tomb Raider franchise, bar off areas until you have the right equipment or abilities to access them. However, this doesn't ignore the fact that there's sometimes hundreds of these things, even when their accessibility to the player is staged out like this. This is when we start to think about traveling. The player can want to do all these objectives, but they need to get there first. And the means of travel available to the player greatly impacts how they interpret this abundance of side activities. If all you have available is walking from point A to B, it feels slow, and the player might not feel it's worth their time to do these things. Games that give you a faster means of travel, or even teleporter-esque fast travel, can help the player feel more motivated to do these side activities, because as beautiful as some of these open-world games are, it can be lost to the player when their focus is on pure traversal instead of taking in the sights. Some players, myself included, will spend time plotting out a route to make the most efficient path through these markers. Stop and grab this collectible, go clear out this bandit camp next, etc. But how frustrating is it when your path leads to a quest that leads you elsewhere on the map, and you have to plan out a new route or head back to wherever your old route was interrupted? Another reason players might get bored is from a lack of variety in what these side activities entail. Obviously, developers can only program in so many specific scenarios, but combine that with the previously mentioned overabundance and it can become an issue. In the original Mass Effect, there's around 40 different planets you can explore, not including any added via DLC. Only 6 of these are related to the main quest, and the remainder serve as optional planets with side content. Yet there's an astounding lack of variety in what you can do on these planets. Some will have their own side quests, but most of the time you just drove the Mako car around mining resources. And to touch back on travel, That car made the process so frustrating. I like the approach Red Dead Redemption 2 took to this. So many of its side activities occurred naturally. You'd be riding around en route to whatever, and you could be approached by someone seeking help, or bandits trying to take you out. Investigating what seems to be a typical house could wind up as a frightening encounter with cannibals. This was refreshing to see, as it eliminated some of the problems I discussed earlier. When you don't have to worry about heading to every map marker you see, it removes the boredom of overabundance. It keeps travel interesting because you never know if your horse ride is going to be interrupted. But mostly, I think, it keeps the variety in side content refreshing. Each encounter has the possibility to be a different experience, so the player's less likely to get bored of them. I want to go back to Yoko Taro for a second here, because something else he says helps illustrate the points I'm making perhaps a little more eloquently. He says, freedom in video games isn't about volume, it's the expansion of the player's perception. The frame the player is given to experience and interact with the world has a big effect on how the player will enjoy or perceive their experience. That's why having an overabundance of side content doesn't necessarily improve a game and can actually hurt it. Taro suggests a fine balance of the two to make the player's experience more enjoyable, and tries to meet that balance in the games he develops. This idea is again why I liked Red Dead Redemption 2. The frame I was given never felt limited to map markers I had to navigate to. Action occurred naturally, making it seem more like real life. However, I think the biggest problem in open world fatigue or side quest fatigue is one that Yoko Taro didn't address. When looking at video games as art, they're an interactive medium that delivers a message of some sort, typically via a narrative. And when handling a narrative, you need to be aware of certain guiding principles. Pacing, or the rate at which the player experiences certain things, is one of the most important, and it's here where I take the most issue. Most open-world type games do little to make the stakes feel real. By that, I mean there's very little urgency on part of the game itself to continue certain quests. No matter how serious the main story may be, some games do little to make the player feel that, at least in terms of available options. In Horizon Zero Dawn, the last quest has you dealing with a very serious threat that's been alluded to the entirety of the game. The quests leading up to this paint this threat as imminent, and in a more traditional story, the protagonist would jump immediately into this call to arms. However, it's possible in case of Horizon Zero Dawn to ignore this, and handle any amount of side content the player wishes before tackling this threat. In the original Mass Effect, I got so lost in the same idea that when I returned to the main quest, I couldn't remember main plot points from earlier. I was even confused as to who Saren is for a brief moment. I see this as an issue. Saren is debatably the main antagonist of the game, yet the freedom to ignore that for up to 24 hours of other activities left me as the player confused. I appreciate the idea, no matter how much this may have upset others, to force an early point of no return for the player in Final Fantasy XV. This helps the pacing of the story a lot by ensuring that the climax and surrounding portions of the story are experienced intact, without the option of getting sidetracked at all. I also like in Mass Effect 2 that there are consequences to certain main plot missions should the player not act immediately on them. It helps create better stakes for the player. You can experience the pacing of the story more fully, as opposed to getting lost in any optional content. Really, all these points I've made lead to a singular idea. Side quest fatigue is a result of the player becoming less immersed in the game world, and any of the reasons listed previously can result in that. Planning out routes to reach all available content is something the player does via a menu map that the protagonist would certainly not have access to in-game. Realizing you've done the same side quest multiple times with slightly different reskins makes the player realize the limitations of the developers. Getting lost from the main plot because you've spent so much time doing side content confuses the player. These all impact the player in a negative way. They get pulled out of the game and have to encounter more real-world thoughts. When I play a game, I want to get lost in that world, and share thoughts about the story, characters, or anything else with the protagonist of the game, not myself. If I become unimmersed in a game, it turns into exactly what Yoko Taro was talking about. These tasks I once found fun have become chores. I was so consumed with experiencing everything the original Mass Effect had to offer that I was using a fan-made checklist to guide myself through the world, and nothing kills immersion more than pausing the game to make sure I was doing the things I wanted to be doing. I enjoyed the idea of the sinking city because it helped close this issue. In true detective nature, I had no waypoints set for me and had to figure out where to go on my own. Unfortunately, the rest of the game wasn't that great, but I liked that it helped put initiative into my hands about where to go or what to do, as opposed to other open world games where I was relying so heavily on map markers and icons to create my experience and journey. So whose fault is this? The player? The developer? I don't think it's a black and white answer. When I asked around about this idea, I couldn't get a clear response, which made me want to examine this, too. A couple bits of feedback I received said something along the lines of, "That's just the nature of open world games." And that's very true. Players like me who want to experience everything the game has to offer will be more susceptible to side quest fatigue. As I said before, there's a line where the amount of content in a game goes from more than enough to too much. People seeking 100% completion are bound to hit this point sooner than others. Perhaps I should focus on making side content feel more naturally occurring, like in Red Dead Redemption 2. If I made myself not plan out routes to collectibles or tried to find a better balance in how often I do side quests versus main quests, the experience would be more enjoyable for me. Maybe I decide not to touch side content at all until I've beaten the main game. The content is meant to be supplementary, so maybe I should enjoy it like I would something like an extended cut of a movie. I've seen the main story, let's go back and imagine what could also happen along the way. But again, these are just the nature of open world games. It could be that I should recognize I may not have much fun with them and opt not to play them outright. It would be the same approach I've taken with games like Dark Souls, recognizing that I'm just not patient enough to get good at those games. However, I also don't feel that this falls entirely on the player. I think the fair bulk of games should be made in a way that they can be enjoyed by anyone who picks them up, or at least have the potential for it. Wherein I know that I personally wouldn't enjoy Dark Souls from the onset, I do enjoy these open world games for a large portion of the experience. There's a reason it's called side quest fatigue and not side quest barrier. Developers face problems when making open world games, mainly making those worlds feel alive. The world building done to create this is just as important as any of the characters or the story itself. Typically, this means fleshing them out somehow so that the world isn't a barren void, and this could end up in developers making content just for content's sake. It certainly felt like this in the original Mass Effect, where, yes, you could go to as many planets as you wanted, but they're vastly empty of things to do or interact with. This becomes disappointing and boring to the player, especially when the things you can do are often just the same handful of things. Again, I love how naturally this happens in Red Dead Redemption 2. You can tell the developers put a lot of focus in making their world feel truly alive for the player. You aren't just heading the map markers that would wait the entire length of the game to be uncovered. Events happen in real time, and the player responds to these as such. I think Rockstar hit it out of the park with this, and I'd love to see more developers follow that example. So, I'm not trying to bash on open world games here. I do really enjoy them, at least until the side quest fatigue sets in. The list of games I've played, then gotten bored of and shelved, includes Horizon Zero Dawn, Mass Effect, The Witcher 3, and so many more. For many of these games, I do eventually go back and force myself to finish them, and I'm really happy with the game when I do. However, I'm still forcing through a lot of aspects of the game, and I wish this wasn't the case. Even if it took 3 times to try and play through the original Mass Effect, I'm still happy I did. I just wish the game felt more natural to me, and I wasn't forcing myself to do so. If you're wondering why I haven't mentioned Skyrim throughout any of this, the game that many hold as their favorite open world game, it's because it's one of those games I did shelve. I've seen the opening cutscene maybe a dozen times in my attempts to finally play it, but as soon as the world opens up, I lose so much interest for many of the reasons listed above. This tends to be why I stick to more linear games, like Uncharted or Devil May Cry or hell, even Kingdom Hearts. I like that I can play through the game without wondering what to do or where to go next. To me as a player, this kind of experience feels a lot better. But that doesn't mean I've had a bad time with open world games. I just tend to get worn out while playing them, and again, I wish this wasn't the case. So again, I'm not trying to bash on open world games. I think they present a very fun type of gameplay, and it just might not be for me. However, I think there's a serious challenge in these games, side quest fatigue, and whether the player needs to reshape their mind in order to combat this, or the developer needs to take different actions in making the game to avoid this. It exists all the same. I do hope we see a better balance to this in the future, where things occur in-game more naturally, leaving the player excited for a long section of traveling, in the case that they come across their next favorite experience in a video game.